This museum, which is in Paracas, Peru, has 5 distinct cultures that lived in this area. First you have the Paracas, then you have the Nazca, then you have the Wari, then you have the Chibca, and finally you have the Inca. So all of these artifacts were found within about a 10-mile radius of this location. So the first culture, and probably the most interesting culture, is the Paracas, and these are some of their artifacts. The Paracas suddenly arrive on the coast of Peru at 800 BC and then disappear about 100 AD, and the mystery is what happened to them. There's the conventional story by archaeologists who believe that the Nazca and the Paracas basically became one culture, but we're going to see evidence today that the Nazca actually wiped out the royal Paracas people who had elongated heads, and that's a location we'll be at called Camacho. The Paracas disappeared 2,000 years ago approximately, so the only way we can find out about who they were was through their artifacts, and this case in itself is quite telling because this orangey pink shell is called spongulus, and it's only found on the coast of Ecuador. These are examples of the elongated skulls of the Paracas culture. From years of studying this, the largest human skulls in existence are found in one part of one cemetery in Paracas and nowhere else on Earth. People like to talk about the Egyptians and the Maya, etc. That's all cranial deformation. But we have evidence with this one on the left. It has no sagittal suture or no parietal suture, so that's a genetic anomaly. And the volume of that skull is likely greater than a normal human being. Now, a normal human skull has this suture coming across this way and this suture coming back that way. That's what every living human being, as far as I know, on the planet, what their skull suture formation is, but it has an extra one coming down the forehead. Again, it's not a crack, it's a suture line, and any physician who's looked at that says that's incredibly rare. That's a genetic anomaly. That's just one of the genetic anomalies of the Paracas. So they wouldn't be Homo sapiens sapiens, they would likely be Homo sapiens something else. If any of you have heard of the Starchild Skull, that was, the custodian of that was Lloyd Pye. That skull looks very much like the Starchild. It's smaller, but you see the eye sockets are vertically extended. So very strange shape. We can't really tell where the jawbone connected properly with it. No evidence of teeth. And so it is a genetic anomaly that we hope to be able to DNA test at some point in time. But if you compare a photograph of this one with Lloyd Pye's Starchild Skull, you'll see very similar physical characteristics. If you showed something which looks like a human but isn't human to a medical professional, they can't tell you it's an alien, but they can tell you it's not a Homo sapiens sapiens. So either it's a subspecies of humanity or something more exotic. The middle one is a classic example of cranial deformation. You see the suture lines are normal, but you see compression in the forehead. So that means that the middle person here, their head was bound. And that process lasted 2 to 3 years before, or until the bone officially forms, leaving that person with that shape of skull for the rest of their lives. And then here, we have actually a mummified Paracas. And this person, again, was found at the same cemetery as the one on the left. But you notice, because it's mummified, it still has hair. The hair is an auburn red, and that auburn red is natural. Experts have looked at the hair under a microscope, and 2 world-class experts, and they both said that is not Native American hair, that is Caucasian. So we're starting to get clues about the ancestry of these people. We can see that red hair comes from the Middle East, from Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. And at this present time, most people think that people from Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan are dark-skinned Arabic people, but what's going on now is the genocide of the original people who had this hair color. These people lived between 800 BC and 100 AD. Then they mysteriously disappear. Again, most archaeologists think that they amalgamated with what's called the Nazca culture that came afterwards, but we're going to see evidence today that it's more likely that the Nazca invaded Paracas territory and exterminated the royal class, because only the royalty or the nobility had elongated heads. All of the rest of the population, the farmers, the fishermen, etc., were all normal-looking people. The Paracas tended to have the equivalent almost of mausoleums. They would bury their dead at the same location. Quite often a very deep pit was dug, and then an ancestor would be buried, and then it would be sealed, but then when somebody else in the family died, then the tomb would be opened up, and then those people would be dropped down into the same tomb. So what's intriguing about them is you'll see that the one on the left and the one in the middle both have dark red hair, and the one on the right, actually, when it was unwrapped by a Peruvian archaeologist here, it was blonde. And that shocked us because we were able to witness the unwrapping. And I thought it would probably have red hair, but when it turned out to be blonde hair, then again, you're looking at a genetic anomaly that shouldn't be on the coast of Peru or anywhere in the Americas prior to the arrival of Columbus or the Vikings. So that's quite intriguing. We've been able to carbon date the baby on the right at being 1,930 years old. So that's at the tail end of the Paracas period. And it died, according to a dental expert, at about 18 months. And you can see that for 18 months, the skull is really quite large. And these are also the funerary wrappings that were found with the baby. Again, beautiful textiles, and then tropical bird feathers. So that tells us that the Paracas were trading with the Amazonian jungle 2,000 plus years ago, as well as the highlands of Peru. Another interesting factor is if you look at the back of this skull, you see these little bones, and those are called by archaeologists Inca bones, because the royal Inca people had a very distinguishing genetic feature of having these many little bones in the back of the skull, which is not normal. But since we see them in the Paracas, it's likely that part of the ancestry of the Inca comes from the coast of Peru, from Paracas. And the Inca, most people don't know, the royal people had blonde hair and red hair, again distinguishing themselves from the normal population. This is an artistic depiction of what is called cranial trepanation. What that is that the ancient Paracas people performed brain surgery much more than in a normal population. So scientific analysis of ancient skulls has shown that more than 50% of the people who had major brain operations like this survived for months or years afterwards. And this is 2,000 plus years ago. So again, the question is, where did they learn this technique and why did they do it? The common archaeological explanation was to relieve evil spirits, but that's highly unlikely, not really based on anything. But it's more likely that when we went and we moved from natural elongated heads to the process of cranial deformation, that there were complications, because again, you're binding the head of a baby, and you're not only altering the shape of the skull, you're altering the shape of the brain. So it's quite possible that in the early parts of the cranial deformation process that they had to perform operations to relieve fluid that was building up inside the skull as the result of this head binding process. What they would do is they would put, we don't know why, they would put a little sheet of either silver or gold over top of the wound, and then the skin would grow back, and then that person would have a permanent piece of jewelry basically in their head. But what silver does is it's a natural antibiotic.
So you're putting an antibiotic over the wound, and gold does not react with the human body, so it's neutral. And so also, of course, all cultures have thought of silver and gold as being precious because they're quite rare, but that's an intriguing thing that the Paracas did, and also up into Inca times they did that as well. So that's another possible connection between the much later Inca and the Paracas people. So you see, these aren't simply arrowheads. These are likely tools used for the cranial trepanation process. And it's obsidian. You don't find obsidian in this area. Most obsidian comes from near a town or city called Arequipa, which is hundreds of miles away. So again, you had a trading system between the Paracas people and people who lived in the highlands much further south. This textile and that one, they're 2,000 years old, and look at the brightness of the colors. They're still trying to figure out, the little that people are actually researching them, how they were able to get so many different colors from local plants and minerals, because this area is complete desert. It gets maybe half an inch of rain a year. So that's another mystery of the Paracas, is how did they develop such a complicated system of textiles living more or less in isolation? It's more likely that this is part of their ancestry, and I think this is something that connects them again with the Middle East. The next culture that appears on the scene are the famous Nazcas, as in the Nazca lines and geoglyphs, and you see all sorts of different shapes and all sorts of different natural pigments, most coming from minerals found in the area. So the Paracas produced small numbers of ceramics, but very fine. The Nazca produced millions of pieces. That's why a Paracas pot is worth a fortune, whereas Nazca not so much, because of the amount of material that was created by them. And then the next culture is called the Chibca. And you can see that the design system is different from the Nazca. The pottery actually is quite a bit thicker. The pigmentation and the designs are different. So if we find just this type of design, then we know, of course, that's a Chibca period cemetery. They were also interesting in that they would bury these little human figures as well. These were basically buried, they're made of ceramic, and they would be buried at the beginning of a planting season in a field. Most of them are female, so it's an example of planting the feminine, or Pachamama, which is the Inca term, into the ground for a good harvest. Much more animal-looking shapes like that. The interesting one is the one in the middle on top, because Senior Juan Navarro of the museum labeled that, or he has literally labeled it, is cup with design of UFOs. So he thinks that those are flying saucers that were painted on the surface of that pot about 800 plus years ago. And he was convinced till the day he died that is something that the artist who made that was inspired by seeing alien flying saucers. And Peru is quite a hotbed for seeing UFO activity, especially in the Lake Titicaca area and Nazca and Paracas. If you walk down the street of Paracas and talk to almost anyone, they probably have a UFO story for you. And Senior Juan Navarro, who is the curator of the museum, told us many episodes of UFO activity that he had experienced in this area. He's a very linear thinking, scientific gentleman, but even he stated that he had had some quite obvious UFO sightings in this area. And he wasn't alone. He was always with his family when these events would occur. One example was in this ancient cemetery area. He said that there used to be a small lake there, and that late in the afternoon or early evening when he was there, he noticed that there were glowing balls of light above the lake, and then when he came back the next day, the lake had disappeared. So that's not a natural phenomenon. So the fourth culture involved in this area was called the Wari culture, and they show some influence from the earlier ones. You can see kind of Nazca looking figures here, similar coloration to the Nazca. The Wari were one of the major civilizations of the highlands of Peru prior to the time of the Inca, but they suffered from climate change, which actually is very common on the coast of Peru because of the El Nino phenomenon that happens. You'll either get time periods of excessive rain or not enough rain, and so the Wari civilization collapsed in the highlands of Peru due to lack of precipitation over a number of years, and their fall resulted in the rise of the last great civilization of Peru, which was the Inca. And so Inca pottery is very simplistic. It's actually much cruder than the earliest civilization, the Paracas, for some reason. And one of the interesting artifacts in here is if you see that series of knotted cords, that is called a quipu, and that was an accounting system, base 10. So they had a very complex accounting method in pre-Columbian times, and at the height of the Inca civilization, the Inca were a royal family of people. They were not the general population. We have evidence that the Inca had elongated heads and red hair, and they governed over a population of about 15 million people from Colombia all the way down to Chile and Argentina. And so of that 15 million people, they had so much statistical data that they knew how many people lived in each village, how many people lived in each house, what the profession of each person was, and what they produced and how much they produced. So a very advanced civilization.